Today on Quest, Yogini Linsey Birusingh. Life is a quest for logic and reason. It is a quest to find balance between science and faith. Life is a quest for knowledge and understanding. But most importantly, it's a quest for personal discovery. Whatever your quest, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Welcome to Quest. Hi everyone, I'm your host, Todd Fischer, and this is Season 2 of Quest. For those of you that might be new listeners, let me tell you a little about me. I'm the founder of Metacortex and the author of the best-selling book, Metacortex: The Grand Design. I'm a philosopher, a theorist, and a metaphysicist. I'm a perpetual pupil of theology and an expert in comparative religious study. I've also extensively researched the mind-body connection, anatomy, and physiology. I'm a researcher and a storyteller. And in order to tell this story, the research is necessary, and part of the research is the search. And that brings us to why I created the Quest podcast. A quest is a search for something. And this podcast will show you how we know what we know through interviews with people that have incredible stories of dedication and perseverance. To me, curiosity is part of what makes us human. And there's still so much we don't know. There's joy in discovery. It's what drives us. It's our quest. Hi everyone, welcome to the first episode of Season 2. I'm really excited to have Linsey Birusingh on the show today. She's a phenomenal yogini based in the Midwest. I'm really a big fan of her practice. I actually recorded this interview in December, and it's surprising to me how many of the things we talked about that are actually happening now. I hope you enjoy the interview and what's to come on Season 2. Thanks for listening to Quest. Enjoy the interview. Hi, Linsey. Welcome to the Quest podcast.
Hi, Todd. How are you?
Good. I'm glad we could get the interview scheduled and be able to talk. I'm a big fan of the brand that you're building, and I'm excited to talk about it today.
Me too. When I saw all the things that you were doing, it just completely aligned with where my head is at as well. And I have a background, I don't know if you know this, but in religion and women's studies and interviewing through journalism and of course through yoga. I love delving into philosophy. So I feel like we were meant to cross paths here.
Well, you certainly have an interesting repertoire of things that you've done in your life. Right now, you're primarily have built this yoga empire for yourself. But I want you to go back and tell me a little bit about your early life. You know, where did you grow up? What led you to this?
Well, I've always been kind of a existential child. So I feel like just always growing as a person and having this inquiry about the world and yourself is just a natural progression for a child like me to grow into. I grew up in the Midwest and actually from a very young age knew that I was going to be a journalist. Went into the news, was a news anchor, and a journalist in many different places, but just kind of fell out of love with the day-to-day routine of that and fell more in love with how I could heal not only the places in myself that needed healed, but use those tools to maybe help others on their paths as well.
Great. So did you grow like, when you were young, did you grow up spiritual or religious, or was this kind of world introduced to you later on in life?
It's kind of interesting. I grew up in a church that my grandparents built, the United Church of Christ, and always just a great place to grow up in. My parents still take my kids there on Sundays when I teach, and I try to get there when I can. But I've always just been thirsty for all different sorts of lessons from all different sorts of religions and ways of thinking. So I feel like it's hard for someone like me to be very tunnel visioned in one way. I'm always asking those questions. And that's one thing I think is really important, is just being open enough to admit that there's a lot of things that we don't know. And doing, reading the ancient scriptures or doing what you're doing with the research and looking into things and just opening ourselves to possibilities. So I really enjoy taking not only from my upbringing, but other philosophies as well.
It's always interesting to me when I find yoga instructors, because sometimes you get kind of what I call the strip mall yoga instructor, you know, which is the one that's it's really just about stretching and exercise. That's it. And then you get a lot of yoga instructors that are, that are deeply spiritual, and they start to incorporate that into their practice. Where do you fall in this way?
I definitely believe that the asana, or the physical practice of yoga, is just to prevent dis-ease in the body so that we can explore our higher path, our higher self. And because the layers of physical, mental, emotional, energetic, and the spiritual bodies are so hard to separate, it's really important that we take care of that physical. But there's so much more to yoga than that. So I really don't fall into just that, hey, I'm going to give you a good workout. I think it's a great way to draw people in. And
Yeah.
I always joke that when you think you're working at your yoga practice, yoga's working at you. It's
Right.
I went there at first because I didn't want my body to fall apart. I realized it was helping my anxiety. I stayed for that. And then I realized that the philosophy was congruent with a lot of things that I was already interested in and trying to do to be a good person.
Of course. What style of yoga do you teach?
I am pretty passionate about trauma sensitive yoga. I do a lot with one-on-one clients for mental wellness, but I also teach vinyasa classes and soft restorative yin style yoga. It really is just contingent on who the person is in front of me.
Sure. Tell me about trauma sensitive yoga. I hadn't heard of that until I read your bio and was looking at your website. What is trauma sensitive yoga? How is that different? Who is it for? Tell me about that a little bit more.
Oh, sure. It's actually got a lot of research now, which is good because I know that you're big on research, and I always want to make sure that when we're dealing with people that we're giving them something good, something that's actually going to help them. So I started this back in 2015 and continue to study it and work with people who have just had maybe childhood trauma or sex trafficking escapees. It
Yeah.
can really run the gamut. And what it is it's just an approach that is in tandem with talk therapy, that is a somatic approach to healing. So instead of just talking through things, we're actually bringing the body into treatment. And we do this through empowering them and asking them to feel, because a lot of people can have very difficult relationships with their bodies post trauma. And just having them connect in a way where they can actually have a safe experience that they are in control of. And
Sure.
I've been doing it for some years now, and it's pretty amazing to see when people actually stick with the practice, how it can reduce some of the symptoms and increase some of the quality of life for people.
Right, right. With COVID happening, I imagine that you've had to change the way you teach now, and you've probably gone virtual, and you do Zoom classes and one-on-ones and things like that. Is that accurate to say?
Yes, and actually here, our studio is still open. I don't own a studio, but I work at a studio, and they've got social distancing measures in place. And we have done some teacher trainings and had to go virtual. So it's just kind of a gamut. It's just week by week what they've decided. So it's been interesting just to have to really flow with whatever's going on that week and adapt.
With trauma sensitive yoga, is that something that needs to be done in person, or can that be done virtually as well? Is it healthy to be with the person when you're conducting that?
It's not so much about me being there as it is me being able to hold space for them. So it's interesting that you asked this, because this morning I actually put out a 6-week course that begins at the beginning of January for women only, because I think it is important that there be a safe space, and violence is a lot of times engendered. So I actually just put out a 6-week course that people can join starting in January for trauma sensitive. And I was a little skeptical about teaching online at first. One of my one-on-one clients, I hadn't even met him in person before we started our online adventures. And
Yeah.
it actually worked out really well. I was glad to be able to see him in person once or twice in between some of those sessions just to refine some things. But I think as long as I can see them and they're safe, it's actually been quite effective.
Good, good. Did I read somewhere that you teach yoga for athletes?
Oh, sure, of course. Here's the problem with me wanting to know everything is that I try to study I want to know everything that I can. So I've taken all sorts of orthopedic modules, and I'm always in some sort of continuing education course because I just think as a person we should never stop growing. So yeah, I teach yoga for athletes as well, and it's a passion of mine because my husband is a former professional athlete and I see what that does to the body.
How is that different? How is yoga for an athlete different than yoga for a normal person?
You're looking at someone whose life, a lot of times income, is wrapped up in keeping this instrument of their body completely refined and optimized. So that is where we kind of untether from the philosophical approach of yoga and really just start to look at the anatomical and physiological aspects, which can be fun too.
Interesting, interesting. And yoga has, I would say, and I don't know this for sure, but does yoga have any is there any detriment to an athlete taking yoga? Like, I always hear these interesting things about why as a professional athlete you shouldn't try other sports. Like, I grew up playing tennis and they said don't play racquetball, you'll mess up your tennis game. Can yoga harm an athlete in any way, or is it because, and I always boil this down, this sounds terrible when I boil it down this much, but if the stretching isn't going to hurt an athlete, yoga couldn't possibly hurt an athlete, or is there something that it might?
Yeah, there's a couple of different, I think, key components. Is one, their ego. Can they turn off the ego and not go too far in any one of the flows or stretches? Because, you can tear things if you push them beyond their limits. So I always make sure that everyone's checking their egos at the door. But
Right, right.
definitely you need an instructor who is experienced and cares and is there for your safety to properly guide you. If you
Yeah.
have those two things, it can be really amazing, the range of motion, and I could go on and on and on and on about how beneficial it can be. But of course, people have proper instruction and know their limits, which can be hard sometimes for people who are competitive.
One of the things I admire about yoga is it's an activity you can do for life. You can do it young, you can do it old, and I thought about that when I was learning to play sports. Like, you can't. There's not a lot of people that are playing basketball or football when they're in their 70s. Yeah, you just kind of have to. But people do golf, they play tennis, they do other things, well into their later life. And what I like about yoga is that when you have to give up the weight training, there's still other things that you can still do to keep active for life. And I think that's one of the great benefits of yoga, is that it's something you can do through the decades.
Which is what is it just meets you where you're at rather. No matter where you're at in life, in physical condition, in your mental headspace. I like to think of yoga as like a very low risk treatment for so many of our maladies and afflictions, especially
Yeah,
compared to like other medications, procedures, diets. If you have the right instruction and the right attitude, and you're not like just trying to do some Instagram sort of crazy postures, I mean, if it's a healthy relationship with the yoga, it can be effective on so many levels.
sure. You also teach meditation. Tell my listeners what the benefits of meditation are.
Yeah, and meditation actually in yogic philosophy is one of the 8 limbs. We've got 8 different limbs that we study. The first 2 are moral and ethical observances. And then, you've got your breathing exercises and your physical postures. And then you get into the meditative aspects, which is really where my headspace is at right now. Meditation is so important for so many reasons. And I'll just tell listeners that I think some of the things that we have in meditation, like withdrawing our senses and maybe going inside, are so important. Right now, we just have to listen all day, every day to what 7.5 billion people are doing and thinking every second. That's what we do, right? We watch this continuous news cycle. We worry. We remember. We do all these things that aren't, in fact, what's in front of us right now. And it muddies the mind. So there's this balance that is needed of interacting and informing ourselves of the world, but also like delving into the quiet. And I really feel if everyone were introspective once in a while and studied themselves, their tendencies, their source, would this world not be a better place?
For sure, for sure. When, do meditations, they have to be long? Can you have a short meditation? I think a lot of people are kind of intimidated by meditating because they think they have to devote a long time to it. Can a short meditation be just as effective?
Todd, I don't know what your experience has been or if you've ever delved in, but meditation can be anything from say, in Catholicism, praying the rosary.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a very conscious walk and looking at everything around you. It could be so many different things, and it doesn't have to be long to be effective. I think if you're using it for something like being productive or building new neural pathways in the mind, you want at least 10 minutes in a day.
Sure.
But every small little bit really helps. A lot of times I'll have people who have never meditated before, and we'll just start at 3-4 minutes. Let's just do something palatable, because you don't want to like dread getting to that meditation, right? You want it to be something that actually feels inviting to get to.
Right. Of course. With 2020, we had obviously COVID changed the whole dynamic of the world, and it certainly changed the dynamic of how fitness centers and yoga studios functioned. How has your yoga practice had to change since COVID? How your yoga teaching, how has it had to change since then? You mentioned that your studio is social distancing and you're teaching a lot in Zoom. What else has changed? Are you able to do your teacher trainings? Do you have to change the style in which you teach? Do you worry about on video, it's just one big master shot and people can't see details of things? Like what's challenged you through this?
Well, I'll speak to a couple things. One, it's needed now more than ever, this introspective, intentional based, mindful practice, whatever level you're doing it on, whether you're connecting with God or a higher power during your practice, whether you want nice buns, whatever anyone comes there for, it's looking a lot different because a lot of people just can't get to the studio, even if it is open. It's not with their belief system or their health, whatever it might be. So I had to kind of let go of my background where I like to cut and edit the videos. I like them to be perfect. I like to do my voice soundtrack over it, cut to different shots. And it had to be like, okay, we just have to get out a really nice, well-packaged class in one take. That's what it's going to be. That's where we're going to meet people at. And so not worrying if my cat meows in the background.
Right.
Kind of letting go of that perfectionism and just serving people, because that's what teaching yoga is about serving other people, at least in my brain.
Of course. And do you think now that people are used to being able to take a yoga class, a dance class, do these things on Zoom now, which didn't seem to exist a year ago, do you think people are going to stay doing this? Do you think people will be gun shy to actually show up to studios for a while because they've at least they know they can do it from their home and they're probably enjoying that? Or do you think we'll have a sense of kind of camaraderie and we'll want to actually be around people again soon? What's your feelings on that?
Well, you'll see a lot of change, obviously, in many different vocations. People being like, oh, well, now my employees can work from home. We'll save a couple bucks there with the brick and mortar.
Yeah.
But our yoga community here and the yoga communities that I see when I travel and teach crave that connection, not only with themselves, not only with a higher source, but with a fellow human that they know is striving for good things as well. And when you hear everyone breathing together or chanting together or just knowing that someone is next to you, it's really irreplaceable. So in my personal practice, I don't practice in the studio. My practice looks completely different in 2020 than it ever has before. It's very soft, it's very introspective, it's very meditation based. I only do a few postures and they're usually long holds. But I think when this is all over, people are really going to celebrate the fact that we can come together again. I'll be excited to see that.
I think so. I agree with you there.
What
is your pardon me?
I was going to say, are there things that you're like ready to get out and do with other people as well? Or has this kind of brought you to a more,
for me, it's really weird. I wasn't one that went to a lot of concerts. Like I just occasionally went to concerts, but I see, video of concerts and I think, wow, all those people massed together. It's scary to me to see that and to think that that'll happen again. But what I miss is things like conferences and conventions, that South by Southwest or Comic-Con and those things, which had even more people than concerts have, just tons and tons of people. Like I miss those events, but I think it's a little scary to me to think about being in a big crowd like that.
sure.
And I'll tell you why. It's because, I'm kind of a cup is half empty kind of guy. All my listeners hear me say this in virtually every episode. But I think we're years away from this being over. And the reason why I say that is, these vaccines are coming. I did an interview the other day with a psychologist who was heavily doubting the science behind these vaccines because they're RNA-based vaccines, which could have serious implications on us in the long term. And the public really don't know this or understand this, how this works. And these are vaccines that have been rushed within 8 months. And it seems dangerous to me. I'm a little skeptical about it. But let me tell you, the other thing I think is also the case, and that is, well, this vaccine is going to come out. People will be eligible to start taking it. It's going to take a really long time to get it to everyone. But there's still a lot of people that are kind of the anti-vaxxers, that they themselves won't want to take it. They won't want their kids to take it. And there's going to be a lot of people that are going to refuse this, maybe a significant amount of the population, which means that COVID is going to stay around as long as there's people that it can attach itself to. And then there's the idea behind whether this virus replicates and becomes something else and morphs into a different strain of itself.
Which is seen time and time again in history with different strains of things. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think, we're looking at that amount of time. And also I think just because the vaccine's rolling out, we're still going to have mask mandates. There's still going to be a lot of issues with how people can be seated. And social distancing measures will probably still be in place as a precaution. And so I think we're looking at several years of this. And my fear is that over these several years of still having to deal with this, you'll continue to see an economic collapse. You'll still see restaurants closing and gyms closing and dance studios closing. And I think we haven't seen the tip of the iceberg on this. I think a lot of people are kind of going into this, January, it's going to be a new year, or we're going to get on top of this. I'm not convinced of that. So,
you say that you're a glass half empty kind of guy, which I like the skepticism because I think you can never believe things 100%. You always got to look at your sources. And that resonates with me so much because I'm naturally a glass half empty kind of gal. And my mom has had to beat the optimism into me. So when we're coming back to maybe why you're interviewing me or whatnot, I think what you practice, you become. And so it's always good to have that skepticism, but you also have to have that little bit of bright, looking for the bright spots.
Well, I hope for the best. I prepare for the worst.
Exactly.
But no one knew this was coming. No one, no one could have predicted that this year would become this. This was already going to be a weird year. And when this podcast airs, it will probably be 2021. But so I'm kind of talking about the year we're in as we record this. But this was already a weird year because it was an election year. And election years are always odd years anyways. But then you put you throw COVID into the mix, and then you throw murder hornets into the mix, and then you throw protests and riots into the mix, and like all these things. And it's just like so much for people to have to deal with. And that's why you having a spiritual practice, doing yoga, keeping your brain health right is so important now more than ever before. I think in times like these dark times, people look for other answers and other solutions, and they find their way into a church, they find their way into a yoga class, they find their way into meditation to keep some form of balance and create some kind of hope for themselves.
Yeah, and you hope they go that way instead of, down the other way in a negative cycle.
Yeah.
So it's important that you're having these kinds of talks. I appreciate
the scientific perspective of this. I think we're going to see studies about 2020 for the next 15 years. There are people studying the effects of isolation on people. There are people that are doing studies on how every animal from every animal shelter was adopted during COVID, because every people that lived alone or didn't have anyone at least wanted a pet. And then, they're going to talk about how certain forms of art are dying because mom and pop dance studios can't stay open now. We'll see the death of Broadway. We'll see the death of all, like the ballets in New York may merge because they can't afford to have two ballets now. And anybody that thinks Broadway will reopen in May is crazy, because these theaters are so big, like they can't socially distance. They can't physically really afford to even open if they can't hit a maximum amount of people. That's why shows close on Broadway, because they don't get enough attendance and they can't afford the staff in the building. And so I think you're going to see a whole lot of changes in things. And it's going to be really interesting to see kind of the state of the country and people in it now. And there's not even numbers really yet to support how many people have become homeless. LA's got a big problem with that right now. People that couldn't pay their rent, and they kind of had that grace period over the summer, and then everything became due. There was an exodus of U-Hauls out of LA. There are people that live in storage lots there now. There are more homeless in LA than ever before. And no one's actually been able to actually go out and count and do studies to support all this. 300,000 people moved out of Manhattan in 6 months. That's crazy.
Plenty of people here in the Midwest who are from the Midwest but live in Manhattan, who are working from here right now and living with their parents because they don't want to be in Manhattan. It's not healthy, So
what's weird in Manhattan is, when you're not working as an actor or a dancer in something, what would you normally do? You would take a job as a bartender or a waitress, and that's what you would do until you book your next entertainment job. They couldn't even do that. So a lot of people moved away. Lots of dancers have moved away. Lots of actors have moved away and moved back to Indiana and Kentucky and Iowa, and moved back in with their parents.
Yeah. And, I think it's interesting because a lot of people at the beginning of 2020 thought it was going to be this year of clarity, right? 2020 vision. And
right.
I totally agree with everything that you said. It's not going to be till years after that we actually have clarity and that hindsight to be like, oh, so that's what happened. That's why this all went down. And who knows, even then, if our world leaders or the people in charge will learn anything or listen about that then, going forward. That's always interesting too.
Yeah. And it's odd to hear the different perspectives of people, because there are a lot of people in the religious community that say these are prophesized things. These are end of days type things. And there's other people in the science world that say these viruses are going to pop up from time to time. And, so you just never really know. And America's never really, at least not anyone that's alive today has experienced anything like this. I mean, since like the Spanish flu, there really hasn't been a generation that's had to deal with this in modern times. So we're really getting something we've never seen before here, and it's certainly affected people. What I think is really weird is also for like high school kids that didn't get to have their proms or their graduations. Like a lot of the things that you're like, at least for us, like we were used to doing our senior dinner dances and our proms and all this stuff that we were so used to, kids didn't even get. And there's no real studies behind the effects of these things, or this ambiguous loss, so to speak, that you don't get to say your goodbyes to people, whether it's friends or a loved one or someone in a nursing home that you could just never see again. And that ambiguous loss is rough. And the long-term studies will be interesting to see how to cope with that.
Yeah. And, it's even been interesting just on a personal note. My husband, being a physician, has a totally different perspective, but we had a neighbor who had a stroke this summer, and her family wasn't even getting calls back from the hospital, nor could they go in there. So I think there's all these not only global issues that we're dealing with, but then hitting home on so many different personal levels. And it's just, it has been sad to hear the effects of that. And we're just trying right now to be as responsible as we can, because he's seeing, that there's no ICU beds left right now for his patients. And
wow.
So, yeah, interesting to see those kinds of things.
Yeah. To fix the world, my overall view on this is that I think the problem we have is a population issue. And I think a population issue is always a drain on resources, and bad things happen when you start to overpopulate the planet. And I think the only way we can really overcome these problems is to really look inward to ourselves before we can go out and fix all the external problems. And that's one of the reasons I like meditation. I like prayer. I like yoga. Mm-hmm. I got to look inside me to figure out how I could address fixing anything else. If I can't fix me first, I certainly can't fix anything else,
No, yeah, you have to have your microcosm has to be,
and that's how you have to address it. And there is the end of my book I put out talks about that a lot, and how you need to service yourself first. And my next book will go into that a lot more. I'm curious what your daily routine is. What do you do every day? Do you do yoga? You meditate? Prayer? With your nutrition? What do you do?
As someone who I still do a lot of TV and other work, just because I was a model in a former life and a news anchor. And so I do some video work and things, and my kids are either in school or online. It goes back and forth. I'm either teaching or I'm not. There's not any sort of semblance of normalcy on any given day. There's just not, which is actually fine for me right now. I think everyone right now just needs grounding in some way or another. And my grounding is my at least 10 minutes of meditation, a couple yoga poses. I don't get a lot of time to myself, and then trying to be there for the people that I love, and seeing how I can maybe plug myself in to my community and make this a little easier on other people. So I'm just constantly looking for opportunities to do that. That's it. I have no daily schedule whatsoever.
I'm always curious when I talk to professionals on these interviews what they have, and you're the first one that said that it's kind of all over the board. That's how I am, though. I might have a 2 a.m. workout, but 6 afternoon meditations that are 5 minutes each. So it's like it's crazy by what I do, and I change things up. Like my biggest fear is having such a structured day that I feel like I have a day job, because then I feel miserable. So I'll change up drastically just my work schedule, just to always keep it fresh for me.
Well, that's because there's utility, I think, in some scheduling. If you look at some of the great people of our past, like Winston Churchill had like a really set schedule of how he did things, but you never want it to get mechanical. You always want to be present in what you're doing. And so I think the biggest thing, like you, is I don't have a big schedule, but when I'm in something, I'm in something. When I'm talking to you, I'm talking to you. When I'm with my kids, I'm looking my kids in the eyes. And I think that's the most important thing about the day.
Yeah, I get it. Like, if I was governing over people, or I'm Elon Musk and I have, 16 companies and they're in 12 time zones and I've got to work 20 hours. Like, I get the schedule for those people, but like just the solo act that I am, I can't keep the regimented schedule. Like I can't do 9 to 5. I feel like it's a flashback to high school and having to get up at 6 a.m. and go to school and be miserable all day. And it's like, I got to change it up. So it's crazy how I do it.
Both though, too. I think comes back to I am the worst at self-motivating. I am the worst, and I've really gotten a good lesson in it this year. So I think as two people who kind of work for ourselves and do our own things and decide what projects we want to proliferate, it's been good for me. I think I'm a little bit more type A coming out of this, which I needed because I'm so haphazard. Uh, so I think it's been a good year actually for teaching me different lessons, refining.
What's coming up for you? Do you have new teacher trainings coming up? Do you have anything new you want to talk about?
Yeah, that would be great. So it's just like so many other people, it's wide open, right? We like to think that we know what's coming up and we can plant seeds, but they're all just hopes. I do have in February, at the beginning of February, we will have virtual options for the Power Life 300, 500-hour yoga teacher training. And I'm teaching on the nervous system and some really interesting things that go into how that governs the entire body and even your mental and emotional states, and some yogic application for that. So if people are interested, they can go on powerlife.com and look for that and be a part of our program virtually.
How can people find you out there in the interwebs? You have a website and you have social media?
Sure, it's a little corny, but my website is yogathrill.com, like thrill, woohoo. But I think life should be an adventure. So whatever I do put together, I like to think of as an exploration. And so that's my website, yogathrill.com. And then I'm Yogini Linsey, Linsey, on Instagram. And people can find me pretty much anywhere else except for Twitter, because I, again, don't think we need to know what 7.5 billion people are thinking at every moment.
Right. I get you there. Well, Linsey, I really appreciate you coming out. It was a fun interview for sure. And let's talk again soon.
Okay. Thank you so much, Todd.
Thank you. Bye-bye. There you have it. My interview with Linsey. I hope you liked it. Be sure to check out our website and social media. I'll see you next week on Quest. Thank you for listening to Quest. Please be sure to rate and review this podcast. This podcast is produced by Todd Fischer and distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Be sure to visit the official website for the International Association of Metacomics at metacomics.org or find us on social media for other unique content. And make sure to pick up a copy of the book that started a spiritual revolution, Metacomics: The Grand Design, available for sale online and at most major bookstores.